Thank you so much for joining us for this Cure CMD workshop, The Power of Storytelling and Rare Disease in partnership with Story Collider. We're very grateful to have the opportunity to put this on for you all today. As we know, a majority of our community wants to contribute to science and research in some way from afar. And storytelling and rare disease is a vital part of raising awareness and advancing research toward treatments. Leslie will kick us off and take us through this interactive session today. You are in great hands with her. Leslie, I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Avery. I'll pop on for just a second. Hi, everybody. I'm a person. I'm back here. I'm going to keep my video off. You are more than welcome to keep yours off. Matters nothing to me. So glad to be here. We have about an hour together, and I have a lot to say, hopefully, that you'll find helpful in your future storytelling journey. So we're just going to get right started right now. So if you haven't heard of the Story Collider before, we're a science storytelling organization that tries to basically humanize science, to show the human side of science. By getting people who are maybe professional scientists, maybe people who are just casual science enthusiasts, maybe people who have not taken a science class since 9th grade, who knows, to personally talk about the impact that science in some way, large or small, has had on their lives in some form or fashion. And we do that in a bunch of ways. So we host live shows in cities around the country. The way I like to explain this to people is the phrase I often use. It's like it's stand-up comedy, but for science, which is helpful in the sense that people know what stand-up comedy is, and that's like a helpful mental image. But the stories that are told don't necessarily have to be funny. Some of them, to be fair, like are absolutely hilarious. Others are heartwarming, others are heartbreaking. They can evoke all kinds of emotions, but it's that kind of situation where someone takes the stage, they got 10 minutes, they tell their story that they've been coached to tell. And it's a lineup of 4 to 5 people sharing their stories like that. So we host shows around the country, and then and also in Canada and the United Kingdom as well. And then our team's favorite stories from those shows, we professionally record the audio. And then our team's favorite stories from those shows land on our podcast, which has a new episode come out with every week with 2 stories. If you are interested in checking it out, you are more than welcome to do that. And I'll have links at the very end. I'll drop a bunch of links and resources in the chat at the very end. But that podcast is there. If you want to go to storycollider.org/podcast, you can find all of those episodes. Link is coming later at the very end, so we do that. And then we also host workshops of a bunch of different flavors, ranging from the 1 hour that you're getting now, we'll see how this goes, to 8-hour long, like retreat style, like multi-day kind of situations, to help kind of guide people through the process of what's a story? How do you, like, technically, what's a story? How do you tell one really, really well? How can this serve whatever goals you have, whether it's to become a better communicator, whether it's to advocate for a cause that's important to you? Stories can help do that, right? Guiding people through the process of how to do this well. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next hour. Oh, that's me hosting one of our shows. So I'm based in Los Angeles, and we have a show in LA that we host. So if any of you, I think that Avery had mentioned that there are people, is that right, Avery? People from around the country, around the world involved with this organization?
Yep, people are tuning in from everywhere
Cool.
and globally. Yep.
Super cool. So if any of you listening, either right now or to the recording afterwards, are based in Los Angeles, you can pitch your story to me and my co-producer. We'd love to have you at one of our live shows. I'll tell you more about that at the end. I am getting way ahead of myself, but again, I'm Leslie. Hello. Here's what we'll be doing for the next hour. So we will be talking about, in rapid fire crash course style, why are stories important? Again, what is a story, like technically speaking, what's a story? And then talking about some of those technical components of a story, your event, your arc, your consequence. What are those words? What do they mean? How do I identify them in my own story? We'll get there. We'll also talk about how you make yourself the main character of your own story, and focus a little bit on character development. How do you convey who you are as a person in a way that like fits into the framework of the story? We'll also talk about some strategies for telling stories about potentially tough topics, ways that have worked for people I've coached in the past that may or may not. Different things, spoiler alert, different things work for different people, but I'll share some strategies that have worked for people in the past. in case that's helpful for you to hear. And then time pending, we'll see how I do. Also talk about how to actually integrate science into your story, because we are a science storytelling organization, right? But one of the things about scientists, and I am one, so I can say this, is scientists often have a very, very hard time talking like normal people talk, especially when it comes to the work that they do. So we'll talk a little bit about in telling your story, right? How do you remove some of the jargon out of your story? How do you make it sound like you are just talking to another person, so it sounds like the rest of your story, and not like, I have to roast my friends lovingly because this happens sometimes when I coach them, not switching from your normal talking story voice to like dissertation defense voice, where you just like shift the tone entirely and it sounds different and hard to understand, making sure that the science sounds as understandable as you just talking to another person like I am. So that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the time we have together. But we're going to dive right in, my friends. All right, so why stories? Why are they important? What value can they serve? Here's one of the values that they can serve. So this is Melanie Green. She is a faculty member at the University of Buffalo, and her entire research program, her entire career is focused on this thing called narrative transportation, is what it's technically called. I'll explain that a little bit. So I'd like everyone to think back to, doesn't necessarily have to be the most recent, but a relatively-ish recent time when you were either like watching a TV show, watching a movie, reading a book, listening to a podcast, a fictional podcast, audiobook, something, some kind of fictional something, where you were just like in the zone, so much so that you kind of like felt that you were there almost like along with the characters, that you were like in that world, so to speak, right? If you can generate that kind of moment for yourself and remember the last time that happened to you, that's what the idea of narrative transportation is. And the basic gist behind years and years and years worth of Melanie Green's work is that when you read or you listen to a story, you have the potential to become deeply absorbed or transported into the story, right? That's the idea. It's something, so I'm a psychologist, and psychologists, we have these things that we call individual difference variables, technical term. All it means is that people can score really high on something or really low on something, just like people can be really extroverted or really introverted or anywhere in between, right? It's an individual difference variable. Narrative transportation works the same way. Some people get really, really, really absorbed into the things that they are reading, listening to, others not so much, and it occurs on a spectrum, is the general idea. So what some of her research has found is that the more strongly people are absorbed or transported into a story, the stronger that phenomenon is for a certain person at a given story, the more likely that the moral of that story, like the big picture, like takeaway, the more likely the moral of that story is to actually change their real world beliefs about the issue at hand, which is wild to think about, right? All of that is to say, in different words, stories can and do serve as a powerful persuasive tool if someone is appropriately transported into that story. All of that is to say, effective stories can change hearts and minds, sometimes just as well as, or even better than, quote unquote, like hard data TM, right? So stories are powerful, stories are valuable, stories are important, and hopefully will serve all of you in many, many ways, possibly in the sense of using them as a helpful advocacy tool, in addition to possibly many other things. All right, so let's talk about what a story is really in the most technical sense. So to a certain extent, humans are natural storytellers, right? Whether it's like recapping your day for your partner at the end of the day, maybe you blow up the group chat after you have like a wild experience that you're like, everyone, I need to tell you this like immediately, right? To a certain extent, we generally know what it means to like to tell a story, right? What we're going to do now is get into the technical elements, like the craft of storytelling and how you actually build a story from the ground up and make it really, really, really good. Because remember, if you think about it, if one of your goals is to have your story actually like change people's minds about something, about an issue at hand, right? You're going to want them to be really immersed or really transported into the story. So what we're going to talk about now is the elements, the technical elements of a story, and how you can help make that happen to make it more likely that transportation will happen. And then transitively, that your story will be an effective tool to maybe change someone's perspective, to change their mind, to show them a glimpse into your life, right? And change their mind about an important issue is where we're going next. All right, so in our work with the story collider, this is the big picture explanation that we give of what a story is. It involves believable characters. That's you, we'll get there later, but believable characters experiencing meaningful events. And then those characters have to cope with the consequences of the events they have just experienced. All right, so we've got the characters, we've got the events, we've got the consequences. Those are the big three pieces. We are going to take them apart one by one by one. We're going to start a little bit out of order because it makes sense to do this a little bit out of order. We're going to start with events. So Avery and I were joking before all of you were let in from the waiting room. So Avery's done a workshop with us before, and we have this picture. This is a very polarizing picture for the Story Collider team. Some people really, really like it. Some people can't stand it. And some people like me have kind of grown to love this picture. In any case, that's clearly it's a cow. I call her Melissa, and she's one of the ways that we teach the idea of events. So the general idea, and I will make sure to open up the chat for this so I can see it. So the general idea here is that you see this picture of poor Melissa here, and immediately you have some questions, right? Blow up the chat for me if you don't mind. What are some questions? I've shown you this really weird picture. What are some questions you have about this picture upon seeing it? Like, what are you wondering now that I've shown this random picture to you? Above and beyond, like, why did she show it to us? But about the picture itself. Oh, amazing question. What is the other cow thing? Their colleagues' situation. Incredible, Rachel. What was she trying to accomplish? Yes. To what end? Why is she stuck on this fence? Like, what was the goal here, right? So you see this picture, and it's like immediately, how did the cow get there, right? Absolutely, we have these questions, right? How did the cow get stuck on the fence? Is she going to get unstuck? How is our dear friend Melissa going to get unstuck? What's going to happen if she gets unstuck? What's going to happen if she doesn't get unstuck? All of these different kinds of questions, right? So I like to think of this picture as the perfect visual representation of, you know, the meme where it's like record scratch noise. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation, right? Is how I like to think of this picture, right? So all of those questions that you might have had, and like she's like, yeah, she's so unbothered. She's like chilling on this fence. Like it doesn't, like, I'd imagine that would hurt, but I don't know. But anyway, so all of those questions that you have now that I've shown you like this really random picture, those are the kinds of questions you're going to want someone listening to your story to ask. You're going to want them kind of like on the edge of their seat, so to speak, right? That they hear you talking and they're like, wait, yes, I'm hooked. I want to know more. Keep going, right? And then ultimately, eventually, your story is going to answer those questions. All right. So on that note, I have an example for you. So we're going to have a couple of clips. We'll see how much time I have for all of these, but got a few clips back here that come from podcast episodes from our podcast. So again, these were stories that were at one point told on stage. Here is Rebecca Brachman telling her story on stage. Her story made it onto the podcast. So we have this nice little recording of it. I will play you a little bit of it. It's like maybe about 2 minutes long. Listen to that. Then I'm going to have some questions for you after that.
We use the toxin in the lab to kill cells, and I have just stuck myself with a needle full of it. I strip off the 2 pairs of gloves that I am wearing, and I run to this sink, and I am running water over my hand where I've stuck myself. And I'm not scrubbing it. I'm just sort of squeezing it and trying to encourage bleeding, which means, get the blood come out, get the toxin come out. So this is when you've seen movies and someone's bitten by a snake and they're trying to suck out the venom. And I'm doing this, and the water's running, but I also know that water does not inactivate diphtheria toxin. So I am seriously considering pouring bleach in this open wound. I am alone. I am not only the only person in the lab, I am the only person on the floor. This is like those really tense 2 minutes in the movie where the hero has to decide whether to pull out their own shrapnel or suture themselves with the hotel bathroom sewing kit or cauterize themselves with the curling iron that their cheating ex-girlfriend left behind. And I decide, yes. Pouring bleach on your skin is not a good idea. Pouring bleach into an open wound is a worse idea. But between diphtheria toxin and bleach, I will take bleach. So I'm doing about 3 things simultaneously. I am washing my hand almost automatically. I'm on the phone with my mom, and in my head, I'm running the calculations. Because I wasn't exposed to diphtheria. I was exposed to diphtheria toxin, which is not what Mr. T gets on the Oregon Trail. The toxin is what makes the disease deadly. Toxin is basically synonymous with poison, and the lethal dose is 1 microgram per kilogram. So I'm about 45 kilograms. That means that it would take something like the amount of, 1/500th of a grain of salt. So take a grain of salt and divide it into 500 sub pieces. And one of those is what it would take to kill me.
All right, folks, how we doing after that? Let me know in the chat. Just drop some adjectives. How are we doing? How are we feeling? Yikes, right? Yikes on a bike. So, I mean, she's clearly telling the story. So you know that she's okay, right? But that's kind of what it means. So we call it, in honor of that picture, we call it like a quote unquote like cow on the fence moment, right? That for that entire time, you're like, oh my God, what happens next? What happens next? How did this happen? Like, is she going to be okay? Like, what happens next, right? So obviously the stakes of everyone's story are not going to be potentially like life or death, like hers is right here in the same kind of way, right? But in the most general sense possible. You're going to want to try and imitate that in some capacity, right? Again, as generally as possible, can't emphasize that enough, in terms of moving things along in such a way where you're basically taking the listener kind of like along for the ride with you is the general idea here. If you heard that and you're like, wait, I want to hear the rest. There it is in the chat in case you want to hear her full episode. But that was Rebecca's example of, my God, injecting herself with just a little bit of diphtheria toxin again. Yikes. All right, so thinking of those 2 examples, right? We had Melissa the cow on her little fence, and then we have Rebecca with her diphtheria toxin. One commonality, believe it or not, between the possible story that the cow, Melissa, could tell, and then Rebecca's actual story is both of those are about a very specific moment in time. If our cow friend, Melissa, if she were able to tell a story, it would be the immediate before, during, and after of how she ended up on that fence. What's going on? How did that happen? What immediately happens after she gets off, right? It would be that moment in time. Likewise, the clip of Rebecca's story you just heard, granted you just heard 2 minutes of it, but her whole story, right, is basically taking us through that night and then the aftermath of that night, of when she accidentally injected herself, right? So they're about very specific moments in time. And the reason why I say that is one piece of advice we commonly give people when we coach them to tell these stories on stage, right? And we're in the initial like brainstorming process, right? One thing we always tell people is that you don't have to tell the story of your entire life. You really don't, right? The best stories often can be just about this one very specific moment in time, and that's totally fine. All right. So that being said, now that you know you don't have to tell the story of your entire life, how on earth do you figure out what you want to talk about, right? So it can seem like a daunting task given that you have your whole life to choose from, right? But we're going to break this down into smaller pieces because things are always easier when you break things up like that. So that's what we're going to do right now. Oh, something happened about my animations. There we go. All right, so one good and important first step in kind of building these pieces is to think about the difference between an event and an arc, are 2 technical terms in like storytelling craft. So stories in the most technical sense have both of these things. They have both events and they have arcs. And here's my favorite way to explain. So we've got the sentence at the top. This is a story about the time I blank, right? That blank can be filled in one of 2 different ways. One with your event, which is what literally happened. So for example, stop at the event and I'll give you an example. So in a former life that ended approximately a couple weeks ago. I used to be a college professor. And one of these stories that I would regularly tell my students is, this is a story about the time that I nearly flunked out of organic chemistry, right? That's the thing that happened. That's the literal event. I, a smart person for whom school was her sport, was failing a class miserably. That was my event, almost flunking out of class. All right, that's the event, what literally happened. The arc, on the other hand, is bigger picture. How did you change over the course of the story? What's the broader take-home message here? What did you learn as a result of your experience? Those kinds of things, right? So using my same organic chemistry example, the arc, me and almost every wannabe chemist, oh my God, thank you, the representation I needed, thank you so much. So the arc to my little organic chemistry story, right, is this is a story about the time I learned that failure is not catastrophic. Sucked at the time, but it's okay. Here now, still here, great. So that's the arc of my story, right? Versus the event. The event is what literally happened, and then the arc is bigger picture, how you changed, what you learned, what's the bigger take-home message here. All right. Again, like I said, I am such a teacher. What a sucker I am for these Zoom emojis. Give me a little emoji if that made sense, if that difference made sense. Difference between the event and the arc in terms of how you can think about your story. We good there? Okay, see a couple thumbs, couple hearts. Okay, cool. Cool. If for any reason, so it's an hour, I gotta keep this moving real quick. If for any reason something I say doesn't stick, write your question down. If we have time at the end, I'll make sure to clear things up for you. All right, so that's the difference between an event and an arc. And your story is you're gonna want both of those things. If all someone is doing, and this is often what happens in the quote unquote stories, we just like tell people informally when we're like blowing up the group chat, what have you. What we tend to do is just be like, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and it's just a series of events, right? Stories in the most technical sense are a little bit different in that they have the events, yes, but there's this also bigger picture arc to them, and you're going to want both of those things. Okay, cool. So that's the idea of an event versus an arc. Another way, so I gave you my organic chemistry example. If you want another example to think about the difference, we can think of the 1997 disaster romantic classic, Titanic. What happened in Titanic? Quite literally, what happened? That ship sank after it hit an iceberg. That was literally what happened in April 1912 and what happened in the movie Titanic. In a bigger picture sense, what's the story really about, right? The movie Titanic is really about Rose and Jack and love, or perhaps economic inequality at the turn of the 20th century, or perhaps the hubris of man, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot going on in that movie. So in thinking about the difference between an event and an arc, right? There's another example for you. But in thinking about events, you have your whole life to draw from, right? So again, how do you pick? So some thought questions can kind of help people get there, right? Because without breaking it up into these little pieces, it can seem like a really daunting task. So we're going to do some little games, as many games as we have time for, in our little hour together. So here's how this is going to work. So you see on the screen, what we're going to be doing, once I'm done explaining, is I'm going to give you 60 seconds and set a timer. And I want all of you to think about some meaningful events from your life. We always give some people some sample questions to help get them thinking, but you can absolutely respond to prompts that are not on this slide. You can think of whatever you want, but these are just to get people thinking. So for example, a moment that you felt out of place, or a moment that you stood up for yourself. Maybe there was a time that you like succeeded or maybe failed at something that you really cared about. Maybe you tried something new, or maybe you were surprised in either a good way or a bad way, right? Those kinds of things. So if you notice all of those bullets, right, following the general theme, they're meant to get you thinking about specific moments, not your whole entire life, right? So another thing that came up in our workshops that we've done previously with rare disease patients is that your story doesn't have to revolve entirely around the disease. If you so choose, if you want the disease to be part of the story, great, that's your choice. It can also serve as an incredibly minor character in a story about an everyday experience. Even if it does, it's still a quote unquote rare disease story, precisely because you, a person affected by the rare disease, if that applies to you, is the person telling it, right? So stories about rare disease, for example, do not have to be solely focused on the disease itself. It can serve as a minor character, and your story can be about a really, really mundane experience you had one day, right? So think in that way. Personally, I have a disability. I'm disabled myself, so I know firsthand that it can be really easy to get put in certain boxes that are they're so annoying as you're just kind of like moving through life. So in that vein, please don't feel like whatever story you tell has to fit into any kind of like prescribed box. You can answer these questions. You can think about a bigger story that you want to tell in literally any way you like. Okay. All right. So that being said, all of my explanation out of the way, I'm going to find my phone. I'm going to set a timer for 60 seconds. And the way I like to do this, and the way we're going to do this, is I'll set the timer for 60 seconds. I want all of you to think, possibly type them in the chat or type them in like a text file, type them somewhere. Do not hit enter, do not submit them yet until I say go. That way no one feels rushed and we can see all of the ideas rolling at once. All right. So I will set my timer for 60 seconds, start taking your notes. I will let you know when time is up and I will play along myself as well. But know that the format that we're going to go with is anything that you do feel comfortable sharing. You're going to say the time that I blank, and you're going to fill it in with whatever examples you have. All right. With that, I have talked more than enough. Ready, set, go for 60 seconds. All right, that is our minute. So I'll give you time to collect wherever you were typing, whether in the chat or elsewhere. And go ahead, give us whatever you got and whatever you feel comfortable sharing of the answers that you came up with, and I will play along. All right, at the time I went zip lining, what else do we have? The time I attended a party, oh no, a party where you didn't know anybody. All right. Oh, the time I flashed my entire junior ROTC summer camp at retreat. Oh, I'm sorry, Pamela. The time I realized I shouldn't be a biology major. Relevant. The time I met someone with CMD for the first time. The time I got drunk for the first time and will never do that again. Choices were made, lessons were learned. All right, cool, amazing. Thank you to those of you who shared. For those of you who you don't have to share, it's totally fine. Just think that's totally fine. But from the ones that we see here, right? Just looking at some of these, right? You see some of them and you're like, wait, I want to hear more about that. Like you have, like, I'm intrigued now, right? I want to know more. I want to hear more, right? That hopefully is in the biggest picture possible sense, what you want your kind of story to recreate, right? Is throughout the entire thing, having the listener, oh, I want to know more. You've got me hooked, and so on and so on and so forth with how you construct the whole story, right? But in constructing your story, an event is a critical part of it. All right. So there's the events section. We are done with the events section. We're moving on now in our little definition, right? Because our working definition of a story, it's got these three parts: believable characters experiencing meaningful events who must then cope with the consequences of said events, right? So we're going to move on to consequences, because events and consequences kind of go hand in hand with each other, right? So in Rebecca's story, the audio that you heard, what was the event? And someone can unmute. This isn't, it's a quick and easy answer. What was the event in Rebecca's story? What literally happened in that audio?
She jabbed herself with toxin.
She jabbed herself with toxin. That is literally yikes. Again, yikes. That's literally what happened. What was, and someone else can unmute and answer, what was the possibly potential consequence of that event? What could have happened?
Death?
Yeah, she absolutely, she could have died, right? So see how events and consequences go hand in hand. It's the thing that happened, and then what follows from that, what happens like as a result of that, right? So lots of words you can use to think of consequences. One easy synonym is kind of the impact of something, right? So what's the impact of you using the questions, using the guiding questions from before? And I'll reanimate them in, but just to be clear, you don't have to put these in the Zoom chat because these can be a little bit more personal, and it's not like we've gradually like worked our way up to this level of sharing like we might do in other cases, but you can just think about it, right? If you came up with examples previously, whether you shared it or whether you're just keeping them in the back of your head, if you felt out of place, what was the impact of you feeling out of place? If you stood up for yourself, what happened after that? When you succeeded or you failed at something that you cared about, what then, right? Those kinds of questions. Those are the consequences that you want to think about. So one way to think of the consequences, and I kind of use this phrasing in going through that list, you can think of the consequences as like the so what of your event. You tried something new. Okay, so what? What else, right? You felt out of place. So what? What happened next? Like what were the implications of you feeling out of place? Like why did that matter, right? Because you're going to want to express why this event or series of events, why it mattered to you, because then if it matters to you, it's going to matter to your listener, to the audience, right? And you're going to want to do this in a way where you show rather than tell them, right? Because again, your audience, your listener is going to be more likely to care if they know why the events that make up your story, why they matter. So you're going to want to show and not tell them what is at stake. The phrase show, don't tell is kind of like a common trope in not just storytelling, but like journalism, et cetera, what have you. So in case you are, it took full disclosure, it took me a while to fully like understand like what that meant. And now it's one of the most common pieces of advice that I give once it finally like clicked for me. So in case that expression is new to you or you're like, I've heard it, but I don't get it, I have another example for you from one of our little podcast episodes, which is also a nice segue into our final portion, talking about the characters, right? How do you establish yourself as a main character? So I'll introduce you to, this is Devon. Devon is one of the producers on our Story Collider team, an absolute delight of a person. You will hear, because you're about to meet Devon in like 90 seconds or less. And you'll get an idea of their character real quick. And this is a good example of, again, show, don't tell.
And by the time I was in college with my 4.0 GPA in zoology, I was great at getting male members of the species into corners with me at parties. I could attract them. And as soon as they would get in, and I would say something normal like, how's the weather out there? They would get close, and like clockwork, it would happen. Maybe they have a butterfly on their shirt that I've studied, or putting their arm up, there is a snake tattoo crawling towards their wrist. And as they would get closer, it would come up like hot lava, and I couldn't stop it, and I would say, did you know that the snake on your arm is a lot like a tree snake that can be found in the Amazon? And the coolest thing about that snake is that it can open its jaws really wide, swallow an egg whole, use a reverse vertebrae to crack open the shell, suck out the yolk, and spit out the shell whole. And they would fade into the distance. And I would go home to my 6 herpetology books, my 4.0 GPA, and I would look up my favorite animal to research when I was feeling solitary, the Pacific giant octopus.
All right, so that's all you get for Devon. Let me take I have the link back here. Let me take the link before I move on from the slide to make sure you have it in case you want to listen to the rest of it. Reason why I played that for you is it's a great example of show, don't tell, specifically when it comes to the idea of demonstrating your character, right? So like I said, Devon is an absolute delight. All of you met Devon for less than 90 seconds just now, but even so, you probably have a pretty good idea of like their personality, right? So again, one more time in the chat, just throw some adjectives out there based on the less than 90 seconds impression that you just got. What are some words that you might use to describe Devon and their personality and their character? Throw me some words. Awkward, yes, and they lean into it incredibly. Awkward, nerdy, yes. Brainy and quirky, absolutely, absolutely. All right, so yeah, no other words. Enthusiastic, yes, that's absolutely the vibe, right? So think about now, so you have answers to that question, right? How did you come to that conclusion? Studious, yeah, with the 6 herpetology books. How did you come to that conclusion, right? And think about how Devon helped you get there by virtue of how they told their story, right? Because I ask you the questions, how would you describe Devon? You just met them in like less than 90 seconds. How do you describe them? And we have the exact words that Devon would use to describe themselves, right? Having lived their entire life, again, 90 seconds, but we agree here, right? That's what makes this an example of show, not tell. If you notice, Devon didn't just come out and tell us, hey, I'm a real big nerd. They did not explicitly say that. No, they took us on a journey instead with the herpetology books and the octopus and the blown it at parties and so on and so on and so on, right? That's what it means to show and not tell. Again, sucker for the Zoom emojis. Does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up, either in the chat or with your little reaction. Are we good there on how you might show and not tell? Yeah, of course, to be clear, easier said than done. And if you go through an actual like full-blown like story coaching process, someone like myself or another coach would actually help you do that. But for now, we're just focusing on like understanding the difference between showing and telling. Telling would be explicitly saying, I'm a big old nerd. Showing would be doing what Devon did in this clip, all right? Okay, what else are we doing? Oh, doing another little brainstorming activity. So we're gonna think about some character development. Oh, this will be fun. All right, so again, we're gonna do the same kind of vibe quietly, and for 60 seconds, you play along. Think about some words that describe you, right? And I will do all of my intro spiel and then I'll start my timer. But some guiding questions that I put together. What were you like as a child? As a teenager? As a teenager? What do you like right now? How would your family describe you? How would your closest friends or biggest fans describe you? And then also my favorite, how would your haters describe you, right? And I included that last one, both because like I wanted to make a joke about having haters, but also because it's important to reflect on like the full breadth of our character, right? Sometimes in the stories that we tell, we are flawed characters, and that's okay. So this is just going to be a brutal exercise in self-awareness to round out your night. All right. So if you notice, these prompts may or may not be relevant to the event that you already have in the back of your head. That's okay. This can be a completely separate brainstorming exercise. It's totally fine. But it's meant to generally get you thinking about who you are as a person, right? So same kind of vibe, and I will play along as well. You'll get my adjectives in the chat when we're done. Type some out in the chat. Don't hit enter until I say go, and then we'll see how we all describe ourselves. All right. Your 60 seconds start now. All right. What do we have? Talkative, intelligent, funny, nerd. Oh, good, nerdy, amazing. Eccentric, creative. Pretty shy, but also very fun and bubbly, easy to talk to, personable, confident, arrogant to my haters. Amazing, amazing. I'll do my haters answer. I've been told I'm a lot. Anyway, so we have these adjectives, right? And I don't think we're gonna have time to do like a full-blown like breakout room exercise about this, but I will give you the general instructions for it so that you can, again, think about it in the back of your head to kind of put all of these pieces together for yourself, right? So we have our adjectives that we've come up with, right? So obviously we've come up with these answers for ourselves, right? The next step would be to think of little like descriptive examples, little like mini stories, we call them bits, of what led you to say these words, right? These small little quote unquote stories that kind of for like lack of a better expression, like as you're giving these examples, imagine that we were doing this in a breakout room. If you're like telling this to another person, like the only and we all have these, but the only reaction that you would have is, yeah, I know what I am. I know exactly what I am. And they're like those deeply like on brand moments that we all have, right? So again, just get those wheels turning, right? Think of your adjectives, think of, again, those descriptive examples, those moments in time that serve as like college essay style, like supporting evidence for your claims, right? It's what you want to come up with. Think of those moments that lead you to these adjectives and then really flesh out those moments, kind of like Devon did, right? They were at this party, they were having this interaction, it might have gone well. And then they saw the tattoo and they're like, oh, I have to tell you all about this animal that I care so much about, right? And really like fleshing out those moments is how you can, again, kind of get to the show, get from tell to show, which is what we want. All right. With the time we have remaining, I think we're gonna make it. This is awesome. All right, so after you have, those are the three components, right? We have the event that you come up with that's meaningful to you and somehow are a series of events. You've identified the consequences of the event, the so what, and you've kind of identified like who you are as a person, what your character was like at the time these events were kind of taking place. Once you have those pieces in place, you can then kind of craft what we call a narrative thread of your entire story and kind of putting the pieces together, right? So the good news here is that 80% scientific estimate, 80% of what you need to know about like story structure can be broken down into one slide. And it looks like this. We have the beginning. Something happens. You're setting the scene. You then have the middle. Look at this. See where this is going? And then you have the end. And then in that middle, something changes. And that's your story, right? You're saying kind of like how things used to be. You're setting the scene, and then something happened, and then it had consequences to it, and then this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And then you get to the end of the story where you tie it all up. You say, kind of reemphasize your arc, like what you learned, how you grew, those kinds of things. But at their core, if you were to like reverse engineer any of the stories you hear on the podcast, right, and really like take a really deep listen, you'd be able to like, they'll all sound very different from each other. But even so, in the most general sense, you'd be able to identify like, what was it that changed? What was the event in question, right? What was the arc? And you'd be able to identify those things. Another way to think about it, and especially if you get into like the technical aspects of storytelling, you might see all of these like very technical words thrown around, like the inciting incident, the exposition, the spark, like all of these things. Another way to think about it, it's like this. Things were a certain way someday. And then one day, something changed. And then because of that, something happened. Because of that, something else happened. Because of that, something else happened. Until finally, and then your story's over, right? So at its core, that's really all a story is if you break it down into its little pieces, right? And then we do all of these other things to like fill it out, like the descriptive detail, like establishing yourself as a character, showing and not telling, right? But at their core, if you really break it down, that's what your story's gonna be. All right, so I also want to make sure, because Avery told me that some people were interested in this general kind of idea. So I want to say a little bit about how you would possibly, should you so choose, to tell a story about something that is tough rather than doing like a mundane experience kind of route. If you choose to talk about something that's a tough topic, here are some strategies that have worked for people in the past who I've worked with personally and coached with and coached to tell their stories on stage. So the most important thing to keep in mind is, as life kind of works this way, different approaches work for different people, right? There's no single right way to do this, nor should you ever feel compelled in any way to include a certain detail that you don't want to include, or even to tell a longer story about an entire topic that like you don't want to talk about. You should never feel compelled to do those things. It's really only if you want to. Here are some strategies that have worked for people who have actually done this. All right. I love when I get to do this. I get to brag on my friends. These are both my friends that I coached to do this on stage. So on the right-hand side right here, I've got Dr. Jaclyn Siegel. She's a social psychologist who studies eating disorders and body image from a feminist perspective. She is just fantastic. Her story, and I'll drop the link in the chat in case you want an example of this, but her story is about working through her own case of life-threatening anorexia nervosa, while also working on her master's thesis on, you can probably tell where this is going, her master's thesis on anorexia nervosa. So this is something that's obviously like really, really important to her personally and professionally. And she also, to be clear, proactively volunteered. I texted her, I was like, hey, Jaclyn, do you want to do this? And she was like, yes. And this is exactly what I want to talk about. And she wanted to do this, right? But even so, like still, like that's a tough thing. She also has a previous experience as a stage performer, and like we all don't, but she did. And it was clear that her strategy was to draw on that very specific experience and just like crack jokes left and right wherever she could to help her get through the experience of actually telling the story. I don't know how she did it. She nailed that balance. It was incredible to witness. Her story landed on the podcast. Do I have link. Will it let me copy paste? We'll see if it does. I'll drop it here. There we go. So if that kind of vibe, it's not going to work for everybody, but if the like cracking jokes to get through a tough thing, if that is your vibe, Jaclyn's story is a great example of that. In case that resonates with you, over on the left, another friend of mine, Dr. Christie. She is a public health focused psychologist whose work ranges from like the neuroscience of like risky substance use to bigger picture, like societal attitudes towards like harm reduction as a preventative strategy to like help save lives of the people who use drugs. So she positions herself as both a researcher and an advocate. And those of you who are like deeply plugged into the scientific community might be aware that that's a pretty taboo thing to do among many scientists. Don't get me started, don't get her started on that. But when you hear Nina talk about her work, you can tell that she cares in a very, very specific way. She'll talk your ear off in a very good way about how needle exchange facilities can and do save people's lives. She is fantastic. If you're one of Nina's close friends, you'll also have some background knowledge and you'll know that through tiny little bits and pieces that she'll drop over like the span of like years, it took me years to put this together. But you'll ultimately come to learn that she had a brother who died when she was a college student, and that he died specifically of a heroin overdose. And that's what informs like all of the work that she does and why she cares so much and so deeply. So Nina also volunteered. I remember texting, I'm like, hey, Nina, you want to do this? She was like, yeah, I do. And I know what I want to talk about. I want to talk about my research. Research is research. She wanted to talk about, but she was more apprehensive about the whole thing. When she gives research talks, it's very clear that she cares in a very specific way, but she always like speaks in these generalities. She'll say things like, every research participant has a life that's worth saving, and that life can be saved with harm reduction, that kind of thing. Really meaningful, but still very general. She never explicitly like connects the dots and talks about like her own family's experiences. And her doing this on stage was the first time that she actually ever did that. So needless to say, she was scared to do this, even though she wanted to, right? So she had those two kind of conflicting emotions there. So in working with her, what we did, or what I did, is, I mean, it's super clear that we were going to figure out a way to do this that would work for her, right? We were going to figure out some kind of creative way for her to say everything she wanted to say, nothing she didn't want to say, and also work in like a little bit of advocacy that she clearly cares so much about, while making sure that this was still like a personal story, right? We managed to pull it off. I don't want to spoil how we did it because honestly, I still get goosebumps when I listen to it. Oh my God, I'm so proud of her. I don't want to take that away from anybody, but if that kind of thing resonates more with you, that kind of strategy where you're like, I want to, but I'm kind of ambivalent. I have a lot of like, I don't know, like I want to, but I don't. If that kind of thing is what kind of resonates with you. Her story is not on the podcast yet. Her episode's going to drop at the end of September, but they did live stream the show that we hosted. So if that is something that you want to see as an example, she starts around the 25-minute mark. If what I just described kind of sounds like you, Nina's story is a great example of that. So again, to recap all of that, there are about 1 million ways, scientific estimate, for someone to tell a story about the same event in their life, and you can find a way to make it work for you. If you know you want to talk about a certain thing, but with certain conditions, there are ways to make that work. And if you ever end up like personally working with a coach because you pitch your story and then we want you to take the stage and like we work closely together, we'll find a way to make that work for you, should you so choose. All right. Last little bit, we're going to round this out. Oh, I had time for everything. This is perfect. All right. So last little bit that we're going to do is a little example of how to actually integrate science into your story, and to do so in a way that seems kind of seamless. And it's not like you shift, I was roasting Nina when I made this joke. It's not like you shift into like dissertation defense voice when you start talking about your research and you sound like a different person, right? There are ways that we can, with love, but there are ways that we can talk about science, talk about scientific terms, medical terms, whatever it is, in a way that again sounds more like the way that kind of like normal people talk in our everyday lives, so that the science that you include adds value to the story rather than like confusing people or something. So on that note, I'm going to play this is going to be like our last clip and then we'll be done. But the context for this one is, so this is David Carmel. His father recently had a stroke, and this clip picks up in the middle of the story during a moment where he's actually like taking care of his father in a moment of need. I'll go ahead and play this for you.
We think he's strong enough to take a shower on his own. So I help him prepare, and I start the water running, and I go to the living room. And after about a minute, I hear him calling my name. So I rush in, and I find him standing there in his bathrobe. The water's running, and he says to me, "I can't take a shower. The bottom 2/3 of my body are gone." That's my dad, the computer programmer. Not half, not a bit, 2/3, because having a stroke is no reason to be numerically imprecise. I look at him, and I look at his 2 legs sticking out the bottom of his bathrobe, and he sees me looking, and he says, "Well, not gone exactly, just different." And then he proceeds to tell me how the arrangement of his limbs has somehow been altered. And he starts with his right leg, which he says starts normally at the foot, and then goes up to his knee. And then when it goes further up, instead of connecting to his pelvis, it continues to go up and past his shoulder and around to where it connects with his chest, which then in turn connects to his arms, which then connect to his left leg. And everything past the shoulder is happening above his head, which is okay, but makes it kind of hard to take a shower. And I'm standing there and I'm thinking, holy shit. And then I can't help thinking, cool. You see, there is a representation of the body in the brain. It's called the homunculus. There are actually several homunculi. There's one for the sense of touch, there's one for motion, there's one for proprioception, the sense of where your limbs are at any given time so that you can balance properly. And the homunculus is plastic, meaning it can change over time through experience. For example, the representation of the fingers is larger in pianists. But I've never heard of a complete remapping, a complete rearrangement of the body representation following a stroke. And this would make a fascinating case study. And I start thinking of all the various tests one could do to verify and to quantify the extent of this remapping. And I start also thinking about how we could maybe correlate the symptoms with the lesions that one can see in my dad's MRI. And I can't help rushing forward and thinking about the eventual scientific publication and how cool it would be to make my dad, who never finished high school, a co-author. And just then, my dad says, very matter-of-factly, "Well, I'm peeing." And I look, and sure enough, there's a large wet stain forming on the front of his bathrobe. And as we both look helplessly, I feel embarrassed for him and ashamed of my own train of thought. Later that night, I decide to do...
All right, and that's where that one cuts off. Just relatively quickly for the sake of time. What were some words, we'll do in the chat again, as I like so much, what are some words you might use to kind of describe the explanation that he gave? How did that explanation feel to you? Yeah, it was clear. That's right, because he started with the story. Absolutely, absolutely. So the term homunculus might be new for a lot of people if you don't have like a neuroscientific background, right? But even so, regardless of like what background knowledge you have, hopefully all of you are leaving with a little bit like a new tidbit, right? Of some kind of understanding of what it is, right? Because of the way he kind of like weaved it into the story itself, right? And it was almost as if he was teaching you a new thing, right? It's not like he rolled in and he's like, well, in the brain, in the somatosensory cortex, there's a proportional representation of, like, he was not doing that, right? But instead, it sounded just like he was talking to another person, right? And any terms that he used, like any specialized terms that he needed to use, like homunculus, he used them and then he explained them, right? And it wasn't like he was speaking an entirely different language, right? So that's a great example of how you might be able to like accessibly kind of like weave whatever scientific or medical content into the story itself. And again, sound just like you're teaching another person. Something new rather than like shifting tone entirely and sound like you're speaking like a different like scientific language, right? So that is the example of how to integrate science. With that, oh my God, we made it through all of these things. So I do want to make sure I leave you with additional resources and ways to get involved. So like I said, I used to be a college professor as of several weeks ago, and teaching popular science communication was a key part of all of my classes. And one thing I always told my students is that one of the best ways to become a better writer is to simply like read good writing. over and over and over until you just kind of like absorb it by osmosis, how the writers use their words, how they organize their thoughts, those kinds of things. Same thing here. If you want to develop a new skill, there's really something about just like exposing yourself to that skill being done really, really, really well. So that being said, listening to stories on the podcast for inspiration can be a great next step should you so choose. And I'm going to be very clear, the stories that land on the podcast are like our team's favorites, right? That have, I can't emphasize this enough, gone through so much coaching, right? And so much personalized help to get where they are, right? People aren't waking up and having that final draft version ready. But just so you know about like where things go and what things can look like when they're done really well. Any of the podcast stories would be great examples. We, like I mentioned, host multiple local shows a year in cities around the United States and in Canada and in the United Kingdom. I'll copy paste this list in the chat rather than just reading it to you. If you live in or near any of those cities, we would love to have you pitch a story should you so choose. And basically what that means is just submitting like a 2 to 3 paragraph description that uses all of the pieces that I kind of just told you, right? Like, what are the events? What are the events of the story? What is the arc of the story? Like, how did you change, right? That kind of thing, right? As long as those pieces are kind of there and we can see it really shaping up into something really, really cool, and we're stoked to work with you on it, we'll ask if you want to come tell it on stage and be coached through the entire process. You can submit pitches at that link in the chat. And if we choose your pitch, so if you are in or near Los Angeles, you'd get to work with me and my co-producer, Brian. If we end up choosing your pitch, you end up getting one-on-one story coaching from the two of us. I think we're delightful, for free leading up to the show itself, and then you get to perform. And then again, if it's not us, like it's not me who chooses them, but if other members of our team are like, yeah, that was really good, then your story too might land on the podcast, right? That's another way to get involved. You can also attend an online public workshop. If this 1 hour crash course, you're like, wait, I want to know more. We do host, the Story Collider does host online public workshops. I believe it's 4 times a year, so quarterly. The way they work is they're 6 hours long, which is a long time. So they're split up 1 hour a night over the course of like 2 weeks. So like a Monday night, you'd go for an hour, a Wednesday night, you'd go for an hour, a Friday night, you'd go for an hour, right? For 2 weeks. If that is something that seems up your alley and you'd like to actually have the time to be able to like literally work on a draft and get feedback and dive much deeper into all of the things that I just kind of like threw at you just now, an online public workshop might be a great option for you. The general cost for that is $150 for 6 hours. We do have a limited number of spaces that we're able to offer people for discounted rates, but that's the kind of general going rate. And there's a place on the form. If you're not able to pay that amount, you can kind of let us know. The good news is, I did it this afternoon, registration for our October intro workshop is open. If you want to read more about that, when it is, and what would be happening. It's just a longer version, kind of what we did here, but with actual, much more opportunity for you to actually like work on your own personal story and like bounce the ideas off of other people, rather than just like the crash course that we did just now. So all of that being said, that's all I got for you. Thanks for listening. I hope that was a little bit helpful. We always like to collect feedback at the end of this. So if you have anything to say about how this went, there's your link. I will put this in the chat so you have it. And it would be especially cool if you want to like drop some notes there, because you can probably tell how often I said it. This is the first time we're doing like an hour-long crash course. So I would love to know if this did what you were hoping it did, or if there were things that maybe like you wish there would have been more of within the hour or less of within the hour. Let me know, so that if I do this again for an hour, it can be even better for the people in your seats next time. But that's all I got. Avery, I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I did just want to add that if you do choose to build out your stories and write them out more, just please note that your stories are always yours. So you can use them as you so choose. If you are interested, you do always have the opportunity to publish your story on CMD's site, and platforms, but of course, we will not use your story without your approval. I do also want to thank Leslie and the team at Story Collider. It is not easy to get a group of people together on Zoom and really feel connected in such a short amount of time. It has been an incredible experience learning from you all. Please remember that these are also just foundational tools. They can be applied to all of your stories going forward. But like Leslie said, they do have workshops, public workshops, if you do want to dive deeper. You'll also have the workbook that we'll make available to you guys. And as always, if you have any questions following this session, please reach out to us at outreach@carecmd.org. And then if any of them are for Leslie to answer, we can for sure pass them along to her as well. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great night.